What's up, creators? Taylor Lewis here from the Film Creator Pro team. Check out the latest video we just dropped in our online filmmaking course. Enjoy. Let's talk exposure. Exposure is the amount of light allowed to hit the image sensor of your camera while capturing video. This is one of the biggest keys to making your videos look cinematic. When you're shooting, you don't want your video to be too bright, which is overexposed, or too dark, which is underexposed. You kind of want to find that happy medium area where your image is perfectly exposed. There are three main settings on your camera that you can change that affect this. First one is aperture, the second one is shutter speed, and the third one is ISO. Aperture controls the lens's iris, which is an opening that allows light to travel through it. It is much like our own eyes. It gets bigger and smaller depending on how much light you want to hit the sensor. The size of an aperture is measured in f-stops. The smaller the f-stop, the bigger or more open your aperture is. On the flip side, the higher the f-stop, the smaller or more closed your aperture is. I know that sounds a little backwards, but I promise you'll get used to it. Now, if it doesn't sound backwards to you, then you're just weird. Everyone knows it's backwards. Another thing aperture controls is the depth of field, which is a technical term for how much of your image is in focus. Depth of field has a lot of artistic potential to it. You can draw attention to a certain element by placing it at the sharpest point of focus in a shallow depth of field. Or you can use a wide depth of field to show the details of a landscape. Low f-stops offer a shallow depth of field, while high f-stops offer a wide depth of field. We generally open the aperture quite a bit, if not all the way, because we like the way it draws our viewers' attention to what we want them to focus on. But when we're shooting a moving subject and we don't have someone pulling focus for us, we generally try to keep our aperture pretty closed. This makes it a little easier to keep each frame in focus. Another thing you can use is the built-in autofocus in your camera. Now, we typically don't use this, but a lot of people do, and it depends on which model of camera you're using on how good their actual autofocus is. Aperture also controls how light sources can be captured. When shooting with a high f-stop like f22, it will give light sources what's called a starburst effect. This is a really cool effect that can add a little bit of depth or style to your footage. So aperture controls how much light is coming into your camera. Now shutter speed controls the length of time the camera's sensor is exposed to that light. Here's what it looks like in action. This is a shutter speed of 1 second. And this is what it looks like at 1/100th of a second. Obviously, 1/100th of a second is a lot faster, and with it being faster, it is obviously letting in a lot less light, causing the image to be darker. Besides affecting the brightness or darkness of an image, shutter speed also affects motion blur. Here's an example of an image I shot at a shutter speed of 50. Now here's the same clip at a shutter speed of 2000. This one obviously has so much more motion blur, and this one is just super crisp and clear. In the filmmaking world, we're constantly trying to mimic the human eye because it helps the viewer immerse themselves in our videos. So to copy the amount of motion blur we see with our eyes, the guideline we use as filmmakers is called the 180-degree rule, which is to always have a shutter speed that is twice as fast as your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, then your shutter should be at 48. Or if you're shooting at 60 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 120. By doing this, your video will have the correct amount of motion blur. But the reason I refer to this as a guideline over a rule is because there will be times when shooting at a higher shutter speed is a good idea. Like if we were shooting something on a green screen, then I would probably shoot at a higher shutter speed so I can more easily cut out the background in the editing room. Or if we were shooting outside on a sunny day and still wanted to keep our aperture pretty wide open so we have a shallow depth of field, I would again shoot at a higher shutter speed. It really just depends on what look you're going for when you're shooting. So aperture and shutter speed affect how much light is hitting your sensor. The ISO affects how sensitive the sensor is to that light. But there is one big drawback to adjusting the ISO. That is, the higher the ISO, the more noise that is being introduced into your image. Here's an example of an image I shot at 100 ISO. And here's the same image at 128,000 ISO. This one obviously looks pretty terrible when you compare it to the 100 ISO one. It's because of this we always do our best to keep our ISO as low as possible. There are times where you'll need to raise your ISO though. That's either in a low light situation or in situations where you want a higher shutter speed and a closed aperture. Then you can raise it. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. Your footage isn't going to be ruined. Every camera has a certain ISO range that it can shoot in and still get usable footage. Right now, we shoot on a Sony a7S II, which is amazing in low light. Its ISO range is between 100 and 12,800 ISO. Our Red Dragon has an ISO range of 250 to 1000 ISO. Obviously on both those cameras, you can shoot a lot higher than that. but once you get out of that certain ISO range, we would consider that footage unusable. So those are the 3 main settings that affect your exposure. Now we come to the question, how do I know if something is exposed correctly? Well, when you're first starting out, that can be hard. So there are a couple in-camera tools that you can use to help you. The first one being the histogram. It shows you a reading of the overall exposure of your image. Here's a histogram of a correctly exposed image. You want this area to be more or less in the center of these 2 lines. If it's too far to the left, it will be underexposed. And if it's too far to the right, it will be overexposed. Another tool we use is the light meter. When your image is perfectly exposed, this box should be in the center of the light meter. If it's underexposed, it will move to the left. And if it's overexposed, it will move to the right. Now be aware, these are just tools to help you get the right exposure. So use them as such, because these tools are judging the exposure of the overall image. Sometimes, like when you're shooting outside, to have your subject be correctly exposed, you're gonna have to blow out your sky. And sometimes when you're shooting at night, your background's gonna be completely underexposed. So your histogram or your light meter may be telling you that your image is either overexposed or underexposed, but your subject may be perfectly exposed. So you really just have to use them as tools, not the end all be all when it comes to exposure. Anyway, there you have it. Everything you need to know on how to get the perfect exposure. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you want to learn more about filmmaking or pursue a filmmaking career, please check out our online course, Film Creator Pro. In there, we have over 5 hours of content. We'll share with you everything there is to know about filmmaking, like how to direct actors, how to write, sound hacks, lighting hacks, pretty much anything you need to know. In our opinion, it's a pretty rad course, and we would love for you to be a part of it. So please check it out at filmcreatorpro.com. And while you're there, sign up for our free 40-minute training where we share our top 10 secrets to a 6-figure income. And don't forget to do that YouTube thing to like, comment, and subscribe. All right, there you go. That was the video. Hope you enjoyed it. See you next time on our channel.